Look closely at the hands of the old man sitting on that porch. It is a quiet afternoon in 1999, and the war seems a lifetime away. The only sound is the wind in the trees and the rhythmic bending of a piece of rusty copper wire he holds between his trembling fingers. To anyone passing by, it looks like trash, a piece of scrap metal worth less than a penny. But close your eyes, and the sunlight vanishes. You are instantly transported to the frozen hell of the Ardennes in December 1944. The temperature is 20 below zero, and the darkness is absolute. The American lines are blind, their batteries dead, their high-tech equipment rendered useless by the cold. The German patrols are moving through the trees like invisible monsters, confident that no one can see them, but they are wrong. One man is about to defy the laws of engineering with nothing but his bare hands. The screen goes black. It was just a piece of scrap wire, until it became their nightmare. This is the true story of how a forgotten soldier turned a piece of junk into the weapon that saved his unit. The winter of 1944 in the Ardennes was not merely a season, it was a weapon. By mid-December, the temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, turning the dense pine forests into a shatteringly brittle landscape of ice and fog. The ground was frozen so hard that entrenching tools bounced off the earth like they were striking iron, forcing men to sleep in shallow, snow-filled depressions rather than proper foxholes. But the cold, as agonizing as it was not the primary terror. The true horror began when the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the world into 16 hours of suffocating, impenetrable darkness. For the American troops dug into the ridge, particularly the segregated support units who had been thrust onto the front lines to plug the gaps in the defense, the night was a coffin. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, in a war where vision was the only thing that separated the living from the dead. The German army, desperate and cornered, had launched their massive counteroffensive with the ferocity of a dying animal. But they did not attack these specific sectors with tanks and artillery. They attacked with fear. The Wehrmacht had deployed elite Stahlstruppen shock troops and hunter-killer patrols that specialized in nocturnal infiltration. These men moved through the blizzard in white camouflage capes, blending perfectly into the drifts, silent as breath in the wind. They understood the Americans were blind. The U.S. doctrine relied heavily on air superiority and forward observers calling in artillery. But the heavy fog had grounded the planes and the darkness blinded the spotters. The Americans were paralyzed. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a soldier. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Sentries would stare into the black void until their eyes watered and their minds hallucinated movement, only to be found the next morning with their throats slit, the snow around them undisturbed, as if they had been killed by ghosts. The situation was untenable. The unit was bleeding out, suffering a slow, agonizing attrition, not from massive assaults, but from precise surgical strikes that vanished before a shot could be returned. The command knew they needed an edge. They needed to take back the night. Technically, the solution had already arrived in the form of a heavy wooden crate marked Top Secret. Inside lay the M3 sniper scope, a piece of futuristic technology that promised to turn the tide. It was an active infrared system, a primitive night vision device that used a spotlight to project a beam of invisible light, which was then converted into a visible green image by a vacuum tube scope. On paper, it was a miracle. It was supposed to allow a sniper to see into the pitch blackness and pick off the German infiltrators before they even knew they were compromised. But the Ardennes did not care about specifications written in a warm laboratory in New Jersey. The M3 sniper scope was powered by a heavy wet-cell lead-acid battery, carried in a canvas rucksack. It was essentially a car battery strapped to a soldier's back. When the temperature dropped to 20 below, the laws of chemistry turned against the technology. The liquid electrolyte inside the heavy packs turned into a slushy, non-conductive gel. The chemical reaction required to generate electricity slowed to a halt. When the snipers tried to flip the switch, there was no hum of capacitors, no green glow in the eyepiece. There was only dead silence. The miracle weapon was nothing more than 30 pounds of useless glass and lead. The batteries had frozen solid. The despair in the unit was absolute. They were holding a piece of science fiction that had been rendered into a paperweight by the weather. The officers looked at the dead equipment and ordered it to be stowed away, resigning themselves to another night of blindness. The men in the foxholes gripped their standard M1 carbines with frostbitten fingers, waiting for the sun to go down, knowing that the ghosts would be coming back. In a command dugout, the roof dripping with condensation that froze before it hit the floor, the platoon sergeant looked at his lieutenant. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by days of sleepless vigilance. He gestured toward the perimeter, where the twilight was already beginning to bleed into the trees. He didn't speak of strategy or logistics. He spoke the brutal truth of their survival. He said that they were blind men fighting in a cellar, and the enemy had a knife. He looked at the useless, frozen battery packs piled in the corner, and then back at his officer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. He said that if they couldn't find a way to turn the lights on tonight, there wouldn't be anyone left to answer the roll call in the morning. They needed a miracle, or they needed an engineer. What they didn't know was that huddled in a foxhole nearby, a man who the Army considered nothing more than a laborer was looking at a piece of scrap wire and getting an idea. The soldier who held the solution in his frostbitten hands was not listed on the unit roster as a sniper, nor as an engineer. His name was Elias, a corporal in a segregated support battalion that had been dragged to the front lines not to fight, but to dig latrines, haul crates, and bury the dead. To the white officers who barked orders at him from the warmth of their command tents, Elias was invisible. He was a pair of hands, a strong back, a statistic in a uniform that didn't quite fit. They looked at him and saw a laborer from the rural South, a man whose education, they assumed, ended at the handle of a shovel. They didn't know that back home in the humid heat of Alabama, Elias was known as a wizard of the scrapyard. He was the man who could make a tractor run with a piece of baling wire and a prayer. He was the man who repaired the town's radios using parts scavenged from broken toasters. He understood the language of electricity better than he understood the logic of the Army. He knew that voltage was like water pressure and resistance was the pipe, and if you knew how to manipulate the flow, you could make machines do the impossible. But in the Ardennes, his talent was a secret. The Army of 1944 was strictly divided by the color line. Black soldiers were often entrusted with trucks and supplies, but rarely with sophisticated weaponry, and certainly not with top-secret experimental technology. When the M3 sniper scopes had arrived and subsequently failed, the White Signal Corps technicians had looked at the frozen lead-acid battery packs, kicked them in frustration, and declared the equipment foobar, fouled up, beyond all recognition. They saw a broken, useless pile of junk. They wrote it off and went back to their coffee. Elias, shivering in his foxhole, watched them leave. He didn't see junk. He saw a circuit that had simply gone to sleep. He waited until the officers had retreated into their dugouts, leaving the trash piled in the snow near a wrecked Jeep. He crawled out of his hole, the wind biting through his thin coat. He approached the pile of discarded technology. He picked up one of the heavy battery packs. It was cracked, the acid leaking out and freezing into yellow slush. He knew immediately why it had failed. Liquid freezes. But he also knew that the Jeep next to him, a twisted skeleton of metal that had taken a mortar shell to the hood, contained a different heart. He pried open the back panel of the Jeep's radio mount. Inside, untouched by the cold, were heavy-duty, dry-cell batteries. These were brute-force power sources, designed to push radio signals through atmospheric static. They didn't contain liquid acid. They didn't freeze. But they were dangerous. They put out a voltage so high and unstable that if he connected them directly to the delicate glass vacuum tubes of the sniper scope, the scope wouldn't just turn on. It would explode. It would burn out the filament in a microsecond, destroying the weapon forever. This was the puzzle. He had a massive reservoir of power in the dry cells and a delicate instrument in the scope, but no way to bridge the gap safely. He needed a resistor component to throttle the power down, to choke the flow of electricity so it wouldn't fry the system. But there were no electronic stores in the Ardennes. There were no spare parts. There was only snow and wreckage. Elias looked around the crash site. His eyes landed on the shattered remains of the Jeep's internal communications wiring. A tangle of copper wire, coated in cracked rubber insulation, dangled from the dashboard. It was trash. It was scrap. But to Elias, it was the missing link. He remembered a lesson learned from fixing old farm generators. Wire itself has resistance. If the wire is long enough and thin enough, it fights the electricity. It eats up the excess power. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he didn't need a factory-made resistor. He just needed length. If he stripped that scrap wire and coiled enough of it into a loop between the battery and the scope, the wire itself would absorb the dangerous excess voltage, dissipating it as heat. The scrap would act as a safety valve. It was a piece of engineering brilliance born of desperation, a theory that would get him court-martialed if an officer saw him doing it. He looked around. The coast was clear. The sentries were staring outward, into the dark, terrified of the ghost. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his most prized possession, a pair of rusty, stiff pliers he had brought from home. He moved toward the classified equipment. He wasn't authorized to touch it. If he broke it, he could be sent to Leavenworth. If he fixed it, he might just save their lives. He grabbed the "Do Not Tamper" seal on the scope's casing and twisted. The metal snapped. He began to strip the insulation off the scrap wire with his teeth, spitting the rubber into the snow. He wasn't a laborer anymore. He was an engineer of the impossible, and he was about to build a monster out of garbage. The wire lay in the snow like a dead snake. It was a 3-foot length of coaxial cable ripped from the guts of the destroyed Jeep, its rubber casing cracked by the frost, revealing the dull glint of copper strands beneath. To a Signal Corps officer, it was refuse, a piece of battlefield detritus to be trampled into the mud. To Elias, huddled under a poncho in the bottom of his foxhole, it was the most important object in the world. This scrap wire was the bridge. It was the only thing standing between the impossible voltage of the radio batteries and the fragile glass heart of the M3 sniper scope. He sat cross-legged, working by feel in the suffocating darkness. his breath blooming in clouds of steam that he quickly waved away for fear of revealing his position. The engineering problem he was solving was a lethal equation. The dry cell batteries he had scavenged were powerful, too powerful. They were designed to blast radio waves across the English Channel. If he wired them directly to the scope, the surge of amperage would hit the delicate vacuum tubes like a sledgehammer. The filament in the infrared emitter would flash burn instantly, turning the top-secret weapon into a useless hunk of metal and likely blinding him in the process. He needed a resistor. He needed something to choke the flow of electricity, to tame the lightning before it hit the glass. But resistors were delicate ceramic components found in supply depots in London, not in frozen foxholes in Belgium. So Elias improvised. He knew the physics of copper. He knew that every inch of wire possessed a tiny amount of natural resistance. If the wire was short, the electricity flowed like a rushing river. But if the wire was long, and if it was coiled tight, it forced the current to work harder, generating heat and shedding that excess energy before it reached the destination. The scrap wire wasn't just a connector. It was a throttle. He began to strip the ends of the cable, using his teeth to tear away the frozen rubber insulation. The taste of old grease and bitter rubber filled his mouth. His fingers were numb, clumsy blocks of ice, but he forced them to move. He twisted the exposed copper strands together, splicing the scrap wire into the power circuit of the scope. Then he began to wrap the excess length around the stock of the M1 carbine. He coiled it tight, loop over loop, securing it with strips of black friction tape he kept in his boot. This coil would be the heat sink. It would get hot, dangerously hot, when the power was on, warming his cheek as he aimed, but it would save the bulb. The physical transformation of the weapon was grotesque. The M1 carbine was designed to be a light, handy rifle for support troops, weighing barely 5 pounds. By the time Elias was finished, it was a monstrosity. The massive M3 scope sat high on the receiver, looking like a telescope bolted to a toy gun. The huge infrared emitter hung below the barrel like a spotlight. And now there was the battery rig. Elias had taken the heavy, brick-like dry cells and taped them together into a solid block, shoving them into a canvas musette bag. He cut holes in the bag for the wires to pass through. He spliced the scrap wire into the main feed, creating a crude, terrifying umbilical cord that connected the bag to the rifle. The whole system weighed nearly 30 pounds. It was unbalanced, top-heavy, and fragile. It looked like a science experiment gone wrong, a jury-rigged Frankenstein weapon held together by tape, spit, and a piece of trash wire found in the mud. The tension in the foxhole was physical. Elias could smell the ozone from the exposed connections. He was about to close the circuit. If his calculations were wrong, if the scrap wire was too short or the copper too thick, the dry cells would dump their entire load into the scope at once. The glass tube inches from his eye could implode. The battery pack could catch fire, turning him into a human torch in the middle of the night. He checked the connections one last time, running his thumb over the taped splice. It felt rough, uneven. It felt like a gamble. He pulled the heavy canvas bag onto his lap, treating it like a bomb. He lifted the heavy carbine, resting the stock against his shoulder. The cold wood pressed against his cheek, but soon, if this worked, the copper coil would burn him. He took a deep breath, the freezing air stinging his lungs, and reached for the toggle switch he had wired into the side of the battery block. He didn't just flip the switch. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then he pushed it forward. Click. There was no explosion. There was no flash of sparks. Instead, a sound filled the small space under the poncho. It was a high-pitched, rising whine, ee, the sound of the capacitors drinking the power from the dry cells. It was the sound of the machine waking up. The scrap wire coil on the stock began to warm up instantly, the heat bleeding through the friction tape against his skin. The resistor was working. It was eating the excess voltage, letting only the safe, filtered current flow into the vacuum tube. Alias's heart hammered against his ribs, matching the frantic rhythm of the whine. He pressed his eye to the rubber eye cup of the scope. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second to adjust to the darkness within the darkness, and then he opened them. The breath caught in his throat. The world was no longer black. The suffocating void of the Ardennes night had been torn open. Inside the scope, the universe was rendered in a grainy spectral green. It wasn't a crisp image of daylight. It was a distorted fishbowl view of reality, swimming with electronic static and ghostly shadows. But it was light. He looked up over the edge of the foxhole. The trees, which a moment ago had been invisible monsters, stood out like gray skeletons against the glowing green snow. He could see the texture of the bark. He could see the steam rising from a fresh pile of deer droppings 50 yards away. The infrared emitter, powered by the aggressive surge of the radio batteries, was casting a beam of invisible light that cut through the dark like a razor. The scrap wire was holding. The voltage was stable. Elias swept the rifle left and right, watching the invisible world manifest before him. He felt a surge of godlike power. For weeks they had been prey, cowering in the dark. Now, with a piece of copper trash and a dead radio, he had turned the lights back on. He was the only man in the entire forest who could see. And out there in the green static he knew the Germans were waiting, completely unaware that their nightmare had just opened its eye. The decision to leave the relative safety of the foxhole was not a tactical order found in any manual. It was a compulsion born of a desperate need to test the machine in the wild. Elias didn't ask for permission. In the chaotic, fractured command structure of the freezing front line, a soldier slipping away into the darkness was rarely noticed, and if he didn't come back, he would simply be counted among the frozen dead the next morning. He strapped the heavy canvas bag to his back. It was agonizingly heavy. The block of radio batteries, taped together and humming with volatile energy, dug into his spine like a sack of bricks. The scrap wire umbilical cord he had spliced together snaked from the bag, under his arm, and connected to the rifle. It felt less like a weapon and more like a chaotic assembly of laboratory equipment and refuse. He crawled over the lip of the earthwork, dragging the modified M1 carbine through the snow, terrified that the rough movement would jostle the copper splice and turn the scrap wire into a fuse. He moved into no man's land, the stretch of frozen hell between the American and German lines. The silence was absolute, heavy, and oppressive. To his naked eye, the forest was a void. The trees were just deeper shadows within the darkness. He stopped by the twisted roots of a fallen oak, about 200 yards forward of his unit's position. His breath came in shallow, freezing gasps. The cold was seeping through his coat, but the coil of copper wire taped to the stock of the rifle was radiating a strange, dry heat against his cheek. It was working. The scrap wire was eating the excess voltage, bleeding it off as warmth, keeping the delicate heart of the scope alive. He settled the heavy rifle onto the tree root. The balance was awful. The massive scope made the weapon tip forward, fighting his grip. He pressed his face against a cold rubber eye cup. He reached for the switch on the battery housing. His heart hammered against his ribs. He flicked the switch. The hum of the capacitors charging was louder out here in the silence, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. He prayed the wind would carry the sound away from the enemy. Then the tube warmed up and the world ignited. It wasn't daylight. It was something else entirely. It was a spectral, shimmering tunnel of green phosphorescence. The forest floor, which had been invisible a second ago, washed into view in grainy, distorted detail. The snow glowed with an eerie luminescence. The trees looked like gray skeletons reaching for the sky. The image pulsed rhythmically, a side effect of the crude resistance provided by the scrap wire. It was like looking through a window into a haunted dimension. But it was clear enough. He could see the tripwires the Germans had strung between saplings. He could see the depression in the snow where a mortar shell had landed. And then he saw the prey. They emerged from the tree line 300 yards away. A German patrol, 5 men. Through the lens of the Frankenstein scope, they didn't look like soldiers. They looked like wraiths. The infrared system picked up heat and reflectivity differently than the human eye. Their faces, warm with blood, glowed brightly against the freezing air, floating like detached masks in the green haze. Their heavy wool greatcoats absorbed the infrared beam, making their bodies appear as dark, solid voids. They were moving with a terrifying confidence. They were walking upright. They weren't crouching. They weren't seeking cover. They were striding through the open gaps in the trees because they believed, with the absolute certainty of experience, that no American soldier would be foolish enough to be out this far in the dark. Elias watched them. He felt a surge of power that was almost intoxicating. The M1 carbine was often criticized for being underpowered, a pop gun, compared to the heavy Garand rifle. But in this specific equation, the caliber didn't matter. The scrap wire had changed the rules. It didn't matter how big their guns were if they couldn't see what they were shooting at. Elias tracked the point man. The German was carrying an MP-40 submachine gun, slung casually over his shoulder. He stopped to adjust his helmet. In the visible spectrum, he was a shadow. In the infrared scope, powered by the aggressive surge of the radio batteries, he was illuminated as if by a stage light. The copper coil against Elias's cheek was getting hot now, almost burning. The scrap wire was straining to hold back the flood of electricity. He couldn't wait forever. He lined up the crosshair, a simple black T-post, in the center of the green circle on the chest of the point man. He exhaled, watching his breath turn into a green fog in the scope, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the carbine was sharp and dry in the cold air. Through the scope, the reaction was instantaneous. The point man didn't just fall. He was erased from the formation. He crumpled into the snow. The other 4 men froze. This was the moment that validated the entire experiment. In a normal ambush, soldiers react to the muzzle flash. They fire back at the light. But Elias had positioned himself deep in the brush, and the heavy flash hider on the carbine, combined with the distance, masked his position. The Germans were confused. They dropped to one knee, weapons raised, scanning the darkness frantically. But they were looking for a conventional enemy. They were looking for a shape, a movement, a flash. They saw nothing. They were staring into a void that was staring back at them. Elias cycled the bolt. The brass casing ejected into the snow with a soft hiss. The image in the scope flickered violently for a second, a warning that the scrap wire connection was vibrating, but it held. He shifted his aim to the second man, who was shouting something guttural, turning in circles. The German was looking right at Elias, but he wasn't seeing him. He was looking through him. To the German, Elias was just another shadow. To Elias, the German was a glowing statue. The unfairness of it was brutal. It was a massacre waiting to happen. He fired again. The second man spun around and hit the ground. Now, panic set in. The remaining 3 Germans realized this wasn't a stray bullet. They were being targeted. They broke discipline. They started firing blindly into the trees, spraying the forest with automatic fire. Tracers zipped through the air, bright red streaks that burned white-hot in Elias's scope, leaving trails of light that momentarily blinded him. He ducked behind the root, heart pounding as bullets chewed up the bark above his head. But they were firing high. They were firing at phantoms. They didn't know where he was. The M1 carbine, modified with trash and ingenuity, had become the deadliest weapon in the forest. Elias popped back up. The wire was searing hot against his skin now, a physical price for the magic it provided. He took aim at the 3rd man. The hunt was on, and the predator was the man the army had forgotten. The silence that had settled over the Ardennes did not last. It was broken not by a single shot, but by a sensation that Elias felt through the soles of his boots before he heard it with his ears. It was a rhythmic, dull vibration in the frozen earth, the synchronized thrum of hundreds of hobnailed boots impacting the ice. The rumors of the Green Ghost had not deterred the German high command. They had simply annoyed them. The enemy had decided to stop probing and start crushing. Tonight, they weren't sending a patrol. They were sending a company. Elias, positioned on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main approach to his unit's defensive line, felt the air shift. He was the only sentry who was truly awake, the only one who wasn't huddled in the bottom of a foxhole praying for morning. He adjusted the heavy canvas bag on his back. He had added another bank of dry cell batteries to the rig, splicing them in with more of the scavenged copper wire to increase the amperage. The scrap wire coil wrapped around the stock of the M1 carbine was cold now, but he knew that once he closed the circuit, it would turn into a branding iron. He heard the distinct metallic click of a bolt sliding forward, then another, then the heavy, wet cough of a mortar tube being adjusted in the snow. They were close, less than 200 yards. A full infantry company, supported by heavy machine gun teams, was preparing to storm the American line. If they attacked now in the pitch black, they would overrun the support unit in 10 minutes. It would be a slaughter. Elias's friends, the men he dug ditches with, the men who shared his rations and his exile, would be bayoneted in their sleep. Elias took a breath that burned his lungs. He reached for the taped-up switch on the battery block. This was the ultimate test of the scrap wire. He wasn't just taking a pot shot. He was about to engage an army. He flipped the switch. The whine of the capacitors was angry this time, a jagged, screaming pitch that signaled the immense load moving through the system. The copper coil on the stock instantly grew warm. Elias pressed his eye to the scope. The green world exploded into view. The extra batteries, channeled through the scrap wire resistor, pushed the infrared beam further than it had ever gone before. It washed over the valley floor like a spectral floodlight, and there they were, a sea of thermal ghosts, 80, maybe 100 men. They were crouched in assault formation, bayonets fixed, officers raising their hands to signal the silent advance. Elias didn't panic. The logic of the engineer took over. He couldn't kill them all. He didn't have enough bullets, and the wire wouldn't last that long. He had to dismantle the machine. He had to kill the brain. He scanned the formation. looking for the officers. He found a Hauptmann, captain, standing tall near the center, checking his watch. The man was glowing in the infrared scope, a bright white statue of authority. Elias settled the crosshair. The scrap wire was already hot against his cheek. Crack! The captain dropped as if his strings had been cut. The signal to advance was never given. Before the Germans could process the death of their leader, Elias shifted fire. He found the NCOs, the sergeants, screaming orders, trying to rally the men. Crack! Crack! The M1 carbine, usually considered a light weapon, was devastatingly effective when the target had no idea where to take cover. The bullets struck home with the sound of wet slaps in the quiet night. The German formation rippled with confusion. They were taking accurate, lethal fire from the darkness, but there was no muzzle flash. Elias had wrapped the barrel in burlap, and the distance masked the sound. To the Germans, it felt like judgment. The panic began to set in. A German machine gunner opened up, spraying the tree line with glowing tracers. It was a mistake. The bright magnesium flares blinded his own troops and gave Elias a perfect aiming point. Elias put a bullet through the gunner's helmet. The MG-42 fell silent, but the scrap wire was demanding its price. The heat radiating from the copper coil on the rifle stock was becoming unbearable. It was searing through the friction tape, burning Elias's cheek. The smell of melting rubber and scorching wood filled his nose, sharper than the smell of gunpowder. The image in the scope began to warp and tear. Horizontal lines of static slashed across the green view. The wire was overheating. The resistance was breaking down. If the wire melted through, the full voltage of the radio batteries would hit the scope, and the glass would implode inches from his eye. Elias gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain of the burn. He couldn't stop. The Germans were wavering, but they hadn't broken. A group of 10 soldiers detached from the main body and charged the ridge, firing blindly. They were rushing his position. The scope flickered black, then flashed back on. The image was distorted, bubbling like boiling water. The scrap wire was failing. Elias fired rapidly, abandoning precision for volume. Crack, crack, crack. He dropped the lead runner. He dropped the second. The battery pack on his back was vibrating violently, a chemical bomb on the verge of detonation. The wire on the stock was smoking now, a thin gray plume rising in the cold air. He had seconds left. He saw the remaining German officer trying to reorganize a retreat. If they regrouped, they would realize it was just one man. Elias aimed through the static, through the warping green haze, through the pain of the searing copper against his face. He fired his last rounds. The officer fell. The will of the German unit broke, confronted by an invisible sniper who picked off their leaders with supernatural accuracy. And seeing their return fire hit nothing but trees, the terror took hold. They threw down their heavy equipment. They turned and ran. They ran back into the deep woods, fleeing a demon they couldn't see. The scope finally gave out. With a popping sound, the scrap wire melted through the insulation and shorted against the metal of the receiver. The green eye winked out. Elias was plunged back into total darkness. He ripped the smoking rifle away from his face, gasping for air, clutching his burned cheek. The silence returned to the valley, but it was the silence of victory. Below him, the snow was littered with bodies, but the American line, his unit, his friends, was untouched. The attack had been shattered by a piece of garbage wire and the will of a man who refused to be blind. He sat in the snow, listening to the retreating footsteps of the enemy, holding the ruined, smoking weapon that had just saved 200 men. Dawn broke over the Ardennes with a pale, egg-down, unforgiving light that seemed to bleach the color out of the world. It revealed a landscape that defied the logic of the previous night's terror. The valley floor, which hours before had been a churning abyss of noise and fear, was now a silent graveyard. The snow was pristine, save for the dark, frozen shapes of the German assault company. They lay in rows, in clusters, and in solitary drifts, stopped cold in their tracks. When the sun finally climbed high enough to illuminate the details, the inspection teams from battalion headquarters arrived. They stepped out of their jeeps, their breath misting in the air, expecting to find the aftermath of a desperate, messy brawl. They expected to find American casualties, overrun foxholes, and the chaotic debris of close-quarters combat. Instead, they found a shooting gallery. The lead officer, a major with a clipboard and a clean uniform, walked among the German dead with a look of growing disturbance. He stopped at the body of the German captain, a single neat hole in the chest. He moved to the sergeant, a single hole in the helmet. He walked the perimeter, counting. There were no crater marks from mortar. There were no scorch marks from flamethrowers. There wasn't even the brass litter of heavy machine gun fire. The German force, a company of hardened veterans, had been dismantled with the surgical precision of an executioner. "It's impossible," the major muttered to his aide. It was pitch black. The sentries said visibility was 0. How did they target them? Who shot them? The trail of impossible death led them back to the ridge, to the solitary foxhole where Elias sat. He didn't look like the savior of the battalion. He looked like a wreck. He was sitting on a crate of K-rations, holding a handful of snow against his cheek, where the superheated copper coil had burned a raw, red line across his skin. Lying next to him on a poncho was a weapon. In the harsh light of day, the Frankenstein M1 carbine looked hideous. It was a tangled mess of black friction tape, melted rubber, and dirty canvas. The scrap wire that had served as the miraculous resistor was charred black, fused to the wood of the stock. The battery bag was leaking a dark, chemical sludge into the snow. It looked like a piece of garbage that had been dragged out of a dumpster. The major approached, his eyes fixing not on the exhausted soldier, but on the ruined equipment. He didn't see the engineering genius that had regulated the voltage. He didn't see the weapon that had stopped a breakthrough. He saw a violation. He saw a piece of top-secret government property that had been butchered by a support trooper. He kicked the battery bag with his boot. "Is this the M3 unit?" the major demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. Elias stood up slowly, wincing from the pain in his face. "It was, sir. The batteries died. I had to rig a bypass." "A bypass?" The major stepped closer, looking at the charred scrap wire wound around the rifle. "You stripped the insulation off a piece of trash wire and wrapped it around a classified optical device? Do you realize what you've done, soldier? You've destroyed government property. You've created a fire hazard in a defensive position. You could have blown this whole ridge to kingdom come." The injustice of the moment was thick enough to taste. Below them lay the bodies of 80 enemy soldiers who would have otherwise slaughtered everyone in the sector. Behind them stood the men of Elias's unit, alive and breathing because of that fire hazard. But the army of 1944 operated on a rigid hierarchy of race and rank. The narrative of a black laborer outsmarting the signal corps and single-handedly crushing a German offensive didn't fit the report. It was embarrassing. It suggested that the standard equipment was flawed and that the segregated troops were more capable than the command wanted to admit. "I held the line, sir," Elias said, his voice flat and tired. The wire worked. It got hot, but it worked. It's unauthorized modification of sensitive technology, the major snapped, cutting him off. He motioned to the MPs standing by the jeep. Seize it, all of it, the rifle, the scope, and that monstrosity he built. Get it out of my sight. The MPs moved in. They grabbed the rifle by the barrel, tearing the melted scrap wire loose. They shoved the battery bag into a sack like it was evidence of a crime. They were taking away the proof. They were dismantling the miracle. Elias watched them strip him of the tool that had made him a god for one night. He didn't fight them. He knew his place in their world. He knew that to them he wasn't a hero. He was a liability who had played with matches. Before leaving, the major turned back to Elias, his expression cold and bureaucratic. You are to speak to no one about this. You will not tell the other men how you wired those batteries. If I hear that you've been tampering with equipment again, you'll be up on charges for sabotage. Do you understand? I understand, sir, Elias said. The jeep sputtered to life and drove away, carrying the scrap wire secret back to a tent where it would be thrown into a junk pile and forgotten. Elias was left standing in the cold. He was just a soldier again, just a laborer. But as he turned back to his unit, he saw them. The other men, the cooks, the drivers, the grave diggers, were standing at the edge of their foxholes. They were looking at him. They didn't say a word. They didn't salute. But in their eyes there was a fierce, burning recognition. They knew what had happened. They knew who had owned the night. The officers had the report, but the men had the truth. Elias picked up his shovel. The war wasn't over. There were foxholes to dig. But as he struck the frozen earth, he touched his burned cheek and smiled grimly. They could take the wire, but they couldn't bring the Germans back to life. The war moved on, rolling over the Rhine and into the heart of Germany, eventually ending in the rubble of Berlin. Elias survived it all. He came home on a troop ship, quiet and unassuming, carrying a duffel bag that contained no medals for valor and no commendations for tactical brilliance. The army had buried the incident in the Ardennes. To acknowledge that a piece of scrap wire had outperformed the entire research and development budget of the Signal Corps was an embarrassment the bureaucracy refused to suffer. The official reports credited the unit's survival to standard infantry defense and artillery support, erasing the green-tinted miracle that had actually happened. Elias returned to the Jim Crow South, taking off the uniform of a country that still wouldn't let him sit at the front of a bus, and went back to being invisible. He traded the M1 carbine for a mechanic's wrench, spending the rest of his life fixing engines and radios, his genius once again disguised as simple labor. But while the history books forgot the specifics of that night, Elias never did. The lesson he learned in the snow was etched into his soul, deeper than the scar on his cheek. He understood something that the generals and the politicians often forgot. Technology does not win wars. Gadgets, no matter how advanced, are fragile things. They freeze, they break, they run out of power. When the million-dollar equipment fails and the lights go out, the only thing left standing between a soldier and death is the human mind. It is the refusal to accept the impossible. It is the ingenuity born of sheer, terrifying necessity. The German elite had the best training and the best equipment in the world, but they were defeated by a man who looked at a pile of garbage and saw a weapon. That piece of scrap wire was more than just a conductor for electricity. It was a testament to the resilience of the forgotten soldier. It proved that in the chaotic calculus of combat, a 3-foot length of copper trash, applied with the right amount of desperation and brilliance, was worth more than an entire company of tanks. And this brings us back to the beginning, back to the porch, back to the old man sitting in the rocking chair, bathed in the warm golden light of a peace he fought so hard to secure. He stops bending the wire. He holds it up to the sun. The copper is dull now, oxidized by time, turning a faint shade of green, the same green as the ghostly world he saw through the scope so many years ago. His hands are old and tired, but they are the hands that held the line when the world was falling apart. He doesn't look like a warrior. He doesn't look like an elite sniper. He looks like a grandfather. But inside that fragile frame lives the memory of the night when he was the most dangerous thing in the forest. He slips the wire back into his pocket, a small secret talisman. He never told his children the full story. He never sought fame. He knew that the truth didn't need a parade. The truth was in the silence of the living. It was in the fact that 200 men came home to their families, had children, and grew old, all because a mechanic from Alabama didn't know how to quit. The snow of the Ardennes has long since melted. The foxholes have been filled in by time and leave, but the legacy of the wire remains. It is a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest moments of history, there is always a way to turn on the light, if you are brave enough to build the switch yourself. If you believe that the true history of war is found not in the strategy rooms, but in the dirty, desperate engineering of the soldiers on the ground, then you are in the right place. There are thousands of stories like Elias's tales of black snipers, support troops, and forgotten heroes who changed the course of battle with nothing but scrap metal and courage. We are going to find them. We are going to tell them. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we uncover the lost blueprints of victory. Because the equipment might be classified, but the truth belongs to us.